There, much better. We'll take that. All right, as Pastor said, my name is Karen Fisher. I come from Christian Family Solutions. Just a little bit about us. We are a Christian counseling agency. We have several locations in Wisconsin and a lot in Minnesota. We have about 38 different sites now in different states, schools, different locations, and about 132 counselors, I think, across the country now. I've been with CFS for 3 years, and when I started, we had about 72 counselors, and I think we have run out of Christian counselors. So if you know anybody wanting to work in grad school, out of grad school, that wants to work in counseling and would like to work with a Christian integrative agency, I would certainly like to talk to them. We have a pandemic of many sorts right now, and mental health is not the least of them. So be happy to help if we can find some people to work with us. That'd be great. In my past, I have worked with CFS, like I said, for 3 years. Prior to that, I was the Director of Student Health at Wisconsin Lutheran College in Milwaukee. And then I also worked for a number of years with Aurora Psychiatric Hospital in Wauwatosa. I came to CFS 3 years ago for two purposes. One was to begin offering what we call intensive outpatient programs. So intensive outpatient programs are mental health programs where people come in groups, 3 to 4 hours a day, 3 to 4 days a week. And that's to help them be able to function better in their lives. Sometimes they are trying to avoid going into a mental health hospital as an inpatient. So we're working with them with their medications, seeing them almost every day to make sure they're doing well. Or they've been in a hospital and they need a transition back to just a regular outpatient setting. So we see them about 12 hours a week, adults and children, in our Brookfield and Germantown or Appleton locations in Wisconsin. So I do a lot of that. And then the second thing was really education and programming. So to spend time with people in the community, helping you be our helpers. We believe only about 20% of people who could benefit from therapy actually come to therapy. And that means that 80% of the people who could still don't come, and they're probably your friends and family members too, right? So we'd like to empower and equip you to understand more about mental health and also to integrate that with faith in your faith and spiritual life, because that's a very important tool. As CFS, one of our main purposes is to integrate faith with psychology and to measure the fact that your faith life, your spirituality, has a large bearing on how you do with difficulties. And so today we're just going to talk about one particular set of things called anxiety, and see if we can give you a few tools, some things to think about when it comes to what anxiety is and how it works. If I stand here, is this an okay spot? Okay. I tend to roam a little, and I don't want to stand in front of the... So anxiety, a cross I can bear. You know, when we think about the Christian life, it is no different than any other life, right? We all have problems. We all have difficulties, crosses to bear, things that are difficult for us. And so anxiety is probably one of those, and frankly, in the mental health world, it's the biggest. We see more anxiety than we do any other diagnosis. So I'm happy to talk through it a little bit today. One of the things that often occurs when I'm talking with people who are anxious is they have a very difficult time sort of separating themselves from their life. It's very put together, and it often comes down to the capital letter I. I feel like I have to do, or I have to control, or I have to fill in the blank. It's because of an I. I believe I have to do it all, or I have to manage it all, or I have to take care of it all, right? That's what anxiety starts to feel like. So we want to be thinking about that and trying to figure out how do we remove ourselves from the center of difficulty. How do we remove the I in anxiety and try and get through it? A little bit of information for you as to how things are going. This is an old statistic. It's about the same, I think, overall, but it kind of speaks to the mental health population. The chronically mentally ill generally start pretty young, around the age of 14, and by 24, if that's not been addressed, we could consider them chronically mentally ill a lot of the time. What does that mean? That means places like CFS need to keep working in programs for schools. We have several school-based programs. One of them is our STRONG program in Milwaukee, where we are now the only provider in the state that offers mental wellness programming for age 5 to 14. So these are young people. We really want to get in front of them, give them good behavioral management tools, because we know that if we don't, those thinking patterns will just progress. And I'll show you a little bit about how that happens. Another thing that's really important is to understand risk and growth factors. So there's a particular study called ACEs. Has anybody ever heard of the ACEs studies? ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. It became very popular about 6 years ago. Oprah Winfrey did a special on trauma-informed care with 2020, or 60 Minutes, and the ACEs score now is kind of how we measure the risk that a person has had to tolerate in their life that would contribute to difficulties with their mental health. So what you're seeing there is 10 questions that we'll ask someone to assess what is their ACEs score, what is their Adverse Childhood Experiences score. And it's essentially saying, did you have any of these things happen in your immediate family growing up? So what's interesting about it is the left-hand column where it says Kaiser, that's a nationwide insurance survey. Kaiser Permanente, a large insurer, so they've asked millions of people this question, and those are the percentages. 28% of people have been involved in physical abuse in their family, 27% in substance abuse. Now, some of those people are the same people, right? They're choosing the answers more than once. But what that tells me is more than a quarter of the population has at least one adverse childhood experience, okay? More than a quarter. So that's an important thing to remember because it means that it could contribute to the difficulty in dealing with problems in their lives. The middle score is Wisconsin as a whole, so very close to the national average. It's interesting when you take apart certain areas geographically, some geographic regions will score higher in some of these adverse childhood experiences than others. Wisconsin, substance abuse high, psychological and emotional abuse high, higher than the averages. Okay? The right-hand column, where it says ILS at the top, see those high numbers? Those are like 62 and 42 and 50. There are also, a lot of them are repeats where people chose 4 or 5. That group is a group from St. Emilion. If you're not familiar with St. Emilion, they're a large inner-city foster care and adoption program in Milwaukee. What does that say? Right? A lot of the children going through that program have a lot of adverse childhood experiences, and so they're very at risk. That's not to say that more risk equals more mental health problems just by itself, but it certainly contributes, and we want to understand more. So a lot of times we look at ACE scores to figure out. This is a graph from the Census Bureau over the last 3 years of how depression and anxiety are affecting our population. If you're just looking at the bar graph, the blue, it goes anxiety, depression, or both. The blue bar is 2019. The red bar, 2020. The green bar, 2021. Like I said, we're super busy. And why would that be, right? Well, there's a lot of reasons that is. What's interesting to me about it is, anxiety has always been the most diagnosed mental health condition. Most people think it's depression. It's actually anxiety. But what's interesting to me about that is that the depression score in 2021 is now higher, and the anxiety score is about the same. So that means that some people are now not as anxious, but more depressed, which I think is also an interesting thing. And what that means is a lot of the time people can't live in high anxiety forever. They will eventually become depressed. Their brains will eventually start to shut down. That's kind of what we're starting to see, all right? I always say your brain is the only organ with a mind of its own. If your pancreas is broken, you don't look at your pancreas and think, oh, you weak pancreas, what's wrong with you? Why can't you behave better, right? We do that with our minds, though, with our brains, right? If we have difficulty doing things, we will often blame our brain, which is an ironic and sad part of mental illness. What goes on with your brain when you're stuck in anxiety-provoking situations like a pandemic or like an adverse childhood experience is your brain functions a very particular way. God designed it specifically to do things in a particular order. The first thing that it will do is it will pay attention to pain, right? Your body is supposed to protect itself, so pain is the first thing it pays attention to. The second thing it paid, and in pain, you will also find fear. Fear will be a trigger to say you are in danger. So emotions come second. Thoughts come third. So you can try and rationalize yourself out of fear if you want to. It's hard. It's hard to do. So what happens essentially is over the course of time, your brain encounters things. And when it encounters pain or fear or other emotions, it will send up what I call the mental fire alarm. It'll set off the mental fire alarm. And the mental fire alarm will release hormones, things like cortisol, different things to your brain to say, hey, pay attention. Something bad is about to happen. Right? So if you're a person who has that happen often over the course of your life, over the course of time, what we've learned is you literally are changing the structure of a child's brain as you do that. Okay? Because the cortisol, the other hormones start to go higher, there's certain synapses or connections that will not be made or not as well. So there's biology that actually behind anxiety sometimes too. Now that doesn't mean we're stuck with it. We can work with it. But just remember that, right? If the mental fire alarm is going off all the time, your brain cannot slow down. It can't think. It's just trying to stay alive. And a lot of times that's what is going on in an anxious brain. I'm just trying to keep myself okay, right? Sometimes I like to share a little bit about symptomology and what it looks like. Essentially, all of us get anxious or nervous, right? I wish we could change some of the terminology we use in the mental health field because anxious used to be an okay word. I remember my mom would say, we grew up in Michigan and her whole family lived in Wisconsin and she loved them. And we would come visit and as we were driving, she'd say something like, I'm anxious to get there. Not because she didn't want to be there and she was nervous about it. She was excited. I'm anxious to get there. We don't use that phrase very much anymore. Anxiety has just got a negative connotation. But we all have anxiety. We all worry. To what extent and how pervasively is how we determine generalized anxiety or other types of anxiety disorders. So is it excessive and inappropriate? Okay, is it large and incongruent to what's happening? Is it chronic, long periods of time? Pervasive, it gets into everything, not just maybe one thing? And is it disabling, that I cannot do the tasks of my life? So that's kind of what we're looking for when we're diagnosing a person with different types of anxieties. Okay, there's many kinds, but generally speaking, there are things that overlap. Sometimes we'll see certain symptoms with certain folks and not with others. And so it gets a little tricky to figure that out. I'm privileged to work with some really great medication managers, and I always wonder how they do it, but there's kind of a logarithm to use to say this is what this looks like. Anxiety looks more like this, depression looks more like this. Okay, so that's kind of just a little bit of background information on it. So, how to think about this? You're giggling. This is what I say to people when I work with them on anxiety. Everything feels like there's a lion in the room, doesn't it? Everything feels large, everything feels scary, everything feels like I'm not gonna be able to get through it. And it's everyday things, it's just a room, right? So the lion in the room, how would we tame that, or how would we get our heads around what does that mean? How am I gonna get through life if this is how things feel? And the answer is, I have to take my eyes to the room and see that there's not a lion. Now that sounds awful, right? If I said, there's as you come in, I don't know what you call that, the vestibule maybe, right? If I said to you, there's a lion in the vestibule, you probably would all just stand here at the door, you'd probably not go out. At least I think. You probably wouldn't, right? Your fear should kick in and say, no, don't go near the lion. For people who struggle with anxiety, what would happen is I would say to all of you, there used to be a lion in the room, but now I took it out, and I need you to go into the room. Some of you would go. You'd peek in, and you'd see like, oh yeah, I don't think there's a lion. I think she's trustworthy. I'll go. Others would stay back for a little while, but then they'd go. And some will never go, because in their mind, they cannot be sure the lion isn't there. The only way to know is to go. And that's what therapists work with, is to try and get people and their minds to understand what's really happening, not what they think is happening. And it's a hard process, right? Because biologically even, we have some difficulties. So we're trying to not see the lion in the room, know he's not there, and live better because of it. I'll give you an example of how this works, how anxiety plays a role, and then how we might intervene. Because remember I said we can't really change the feelings. Feelings are very hard to change. Have you ever tried to do that? Just change a feeling? I have a fear of heights. Legitimate, I think. When I was a kid, we grew up in Michigan, and we would drive, like I said, over to Wisconsin, through the northern part of the states of Michigan and Wisconsin. Do you know how you do that? You go over a huge bridge, right? The Mackinac Bridge, it's 5 miles long, a suspension bridge. You can see right through it. I don't know why. It's about 30 stories high in the middle. When I was in high school, a car blew off the bridge. The wind was so high. Now, that would have been one thing, except when I learned that story, I was actually in the car on the bridge, and my brother told me the story as we were crossing the bridge. So what has happened is I have generalized. The event is cars fly off bridges, so I'm told, right? The emotion is fear. I have now, because I've thought about it so much, generalized bridges and fear. I have yet to drive over the Hone Bridge. Very hard. Okay, so events cause emotions. I could want that fear to go down. Man, have I tried. Okay, but it's just now generalized. It is part of me. It's very hard for me to even work on that. The difficulty becomes that over time, people will generalize these things, and they will do whatever fear is telling them to do. So the event is, I learn that bridges are scary. I put the two together. I think about it all the time. And now, anytime I ever come near a bridge, I will be afraid. Fear makes me want to avoid. Avoid, avoid, avoid. Get out. Go a different way. Don't go over the Home Bridge ever. Avoid, avoid, avoid. Now, what does that do? Over the course of time, if I continue to do that, whatever fear is trying to get me to do, which is avoid, my fear will not get smaller. It will get bigger. Okay? I get momentary relief because I don't have to go over the bridge, right? But over the course of time, I am unable to do this thing because I have avoided it for so long. The fear will tell me there's absolutely no way you can do that. Okay? So that's kind of how anxiety works. The events prompt it. They could be biological, they could be environmental, they could be those adverse childhood experiences, they could be a one-time event, they could be a lot of things. But if that fear gets big enough that I just keep doing whatever it wants me to do, it will never go down. Okay? So that's the basics of how it works. But I can't change the event, can I? I can't change the fact that he told me that. I can't change the fact that I thought about it millions of times. I can't change the family I grew up in or the way they treated each other. I can't change my biology because cortisol's been flowing through my brain since childhood. I can't change any of that. Which also means the emotions pop up a lot. And I can't really change those either. And that's where therapy comes in, because what we learn is in order to change anything else, we also have to change the action. If I change the action, I can change the emotion. Most people don't think of it that way, but that's how it works, okay? So how would I do that? So I still have the event, whatever it is that causes the fear causes me to want to avoid. I have to ask myself 2 questions if I want to change that. Number 1 is it justified? Is my fear or my action of avoiding, is it justified? Now, remember what I said about order of operations. Your brain will pay attention to pain first, emotion second, thoughts third. So if I'm looking at that question, am I justified in avoiding the Hoan Bridge? I can tell you I am, right? I feel very justified in avoiding bridges. I feel very justified in being afraid. But the answer is actually no. I am not justified in this because that happened 38 years ago. And it was just a comment, right? Billions of cars go over bridges every single day. I was doing okay until last winter when 2 cars actually did come off the bridges in Milwaukee. Do you remember this? They hit the snow and they went, yeah, I was doing okay until then. And then But I will answer that question. You bet I'm justified. I should be afraid, absolutely, but I'm wrong, right? My rational brain just can't get my head around it. I will justify it. We will justify a lot of things in our own minds for very good reasons. Am I justified in being afraid going to a party when I have social anxiety? I'll think I am, but in reality, I'm not. When have I ever gone to a party and people have actually said they hated me being there? That's never happened, right? It's not going to happen this time either, but I think it is. So I'll justify it. So that's why the second question is there, which is, do I want to reduce this anyway? Do I want to reduce this fear? Do I want to reduce this behavior? And then I might answer yes, right? Because I might say, I love to travel. This is a real problem. If I can't figure out how to drive over heights, I won't be able to go anywhere, right? So I do want to get it down. I do want that behavior to change. That's where I actually get to do something, and we call it opposite action. I look at what is that emotion trying to get me to do? Fear is trying to get me to avoid. What's the opposite of avoiding? Go, right? Go. That is what it is. Now, there's 5 little rules about how you do this, and the 5th one, I know you can't see it, but it says, do that action all the way. That means I can't, if I decide I want to get over my fear of bridges and I want to go, I will do the opposite of what fear is trying to get me to do, which is avoid, and I'll go, but I can't stop halfway on the bridge, and I can't have somebody else drive for me, right? That is not all the way opposite action. I must go. So if I have social anxiety and I want to not go to the party, but then I think, no, I need to get better at this. I want to reduce this fear. I'm going to go to the party. I can't just go to the party and sit in a corner and not talk to anybody. That is not looking to see if the lion is gone. I must wander around and talk to people to see that it is okay. I must get to the other side of the bridge to see that it is okay. Right? I cannot do this halfway. And that's what usually happens for people who are trying to fix anxiety. They'll sort of go, and then they'll get afraid and they'll retreat. And all that does is reinforce the fact that they can't do it. Okay, so when we're trying to help people with anxiety, what we do is set them up with tools, and we do it very gently to say, we need you to do this. You need to do this, right? You want to get this down, right? It's interfering in your life, right? Yep. Okay, here's one little step, and here's the tools that are going to help you do it. There's all kinds of things that we teach people to do in order to safely approach their anxieties, okay? So for example, if I am going to drive across the bridge and I'm aware of that, I'm going to keep going. I'm getting pretty good at it. But I also know that I need to go all the way. I need to be a part of it. I can't just check out. I can't just be afraid the whole time. So I'll use a bunch of skills that I've learned, that I teach other people, to get me there, such as distraction. I will find the ABBA Pandora radio station and hope that Dancing Queen comes on because I know all the words to that song, and I will put my hands at 10 and 2, sing as loud as possible, and watch the dotted lines until they're gone. Right? What does that do? It's opposite action all the way. I got all the way over the bridge, I approached the fear, and I did it. And now the emotion gets smaller. And over time, I'm teaching my brain, you can do it. Look at you, atta girl. Okay, so what we need is the understanding of how the system works. Now, interestingly, this works with all emotions, not just fear, but we're talking about anxiety today, so I'll leave it with that. But it works for all emotions. You just have to figure out what is the opposite action to what that emotion is trying to get me to do, and do that. Okay? I am going to confound it because I love talking about guilt. I'm one of the few people you'll meet who loves talking about guilt, but this is why. God's the original psychologist. What happens when we feel guilt? If we do something that we feel guilty for, which is against our moral code, we will usually, check Genesis chapter 1, hide. That's what guilty people do. Right? And if we hang on to that, and we continue to hide, and we continue to ruminate on the guilt, it gets bigger. What's God's plan for that? Come out of hiding, confess. Right? And then the guilt gets to go down. You're objectively forgiven. So, like I said, you can use that with any emotion, really, but today we're kind of talking about fear. So that's the idea, that I could use opposite action to try and approach a fear, but I need to keep going. Right? Go all the way and do it again and again and again. I have to take my eyes to the room and see that the lion isn't there every single time. Making sense? Okay. So, I'm going to keep flying because we only got a few minutes, but I'll take questions at the end. Next thing, on your handouts, you have something. Don't look at the screen because you won't be able to read it. But on your handouts, something called cognitive distortions. So this is another thing that makes those generalized thought patterns concrete. So probably in my head, I have used a number of cognitive distortions to reinforce the fact that bridges are scary, right? Cognitive distortions, they're just thoughts that aren't real. They're distorted or twisted in some way. And sometimes we can find them and sometimes we can't, okay? I'll give you an example using bridges. I gave you language that I usually use with schools. So if you have kidlets at home, you might be able to talk with them about it. But I'll use the bridge example as I'm talking. So all or nothing, a distortion I might have. It is possible that anyone at any time could fall off of all bridges. I'll say that in my head probably, right? At some point it could happen. Mental filter, seeing the world through blue-colored glasses, no matter what else has happened, it's bad. All bridges are scary. Bridges are just scary. I don't know why they make bridges so tall. I'll say that sometimes. Discounting the positive. Sometimes I'll get to a certain point where I'm getting over the bridge. My husband, if you ever meet my husband, just give him a hug or something, because poor guy. I talk about him all the time, and he knows this. But I thought I had this beat one time. We were in Yellowstone, and it's kind of mountainous, parts of that over by Montana. And so I'm not driving, but I have learned that if you sit behind the driver, you're always in the middle. You're never on the end, which I thought was helpful, but he does not think it's as helpful as I think it is, because I still kind of like kick and claw at the back of the seat. But discounting the positive, I often will not notice that I did okay. Like, I'm still kind of upset about it. Jumping to conclusions, that's an easy one, right? Probably I'll fly off the bridge. Mind reading. I don't know how other people get over bridges. They must have a whole superpower that I don't have. Magnification and minimization. In my head, people fly off bridges all the time. Right? Do you see how these are all distorted? Please go like this. Otherwise, okay. Emotional reasoning. This is probably the biggest one. I feel, therefore it's true. That's the first thing I usually tell people. Feelings are not facts, my friend. Because I feel scared, something must be scary. That's what's going on, right? Should statements. People should be able to build shorter bridges. People should not have to drive over tall bridges. Lots of shoulds. Labeling. I will call myself certain names on how weak I am that I can't figure this out. Okay. Personalization, seeing myself as the cause of negative things, which in fact I'm not personally responsible for. I could blame my brother, I suppose. I kind of do. But see how if you continue to use those distorted thought patterns, you get stuck in whatever the focus of those thought patterns might be. Okay, so the focus of the thought patterns could be bridges, could be people, could be spiders, could be anything, right? And if I continued in these distortions, I will make that feeling bigger. So a lot of the time it's catching the distortions and figuring out how do I reframe those so that they are more accurate. So on the back side of the distortions page, it has this, what we call the 3-column technique. If you have, or if you want to work through an upsetting event, here's what you could do. The left-hand column is one sentence at a time. Here's what I think or feel. As I'm approaching a bridge, I could put, I feel really afraid. I think I'm going to fly off the bridge. I don't know how I'm going to make it. They shouldn't make bridges this tall. Okay, I could do one sentence at a time. Then I go back and I look at each sentence and I look at my 10 distortions and I say, is there one in there? They shouldn't make bridges this tall. Okay, the distortion is a should statement. It's right in there. What's the replacement thought? Bridges have to go over other bridges. They have to be tall, right? I'm never going to make it. That's all or nothing thinking. I've made it every other time, right? So each of those distorted thoughts, you pick out the distortion, you say, yep, that is actually distorted thinking. I can see it. I know what it is. And then I replace it with something that's more true, more accurate, right? It is more true that I get over the bridges every time, isn't it? You don't know me, but I've only stopped on a bridge one time. Every other time I've gotten over them, right? It is true that bridges have to be built tall. It's not a should. They shouldn't. What do you mean? They have to. It's part of our what do you call that? Architecture, whatever, you know? They have to do that. It's not the world isn't against me because the bridges are tall, right? Like, so all of those distortions, as they start to pile up over time, that's what's driving the fear. And if I can look at those thoughts, maybe I can get them down. Now remember what I said, the order of operations, pain, feelings, thoughts. So this only works after the emotions are down, right? When I'm driving on the bridge, I can't do this. There's absolutely no way. I need my distraction techniques in ABBA, right? I need to get the emotions down before I can work on the thoughts. So again, in therapy, this is something really important. We will make people do these over and over again to replace those distortions with replacement thoughts that are true. Right? Because those thought patterns have to get rebuilt. Can't do that when your emotions are high. Can't reason with emotions. You have to wait till the emotions are down and then work on the thoughts. Okay? So that's a way to do it. You can do this yourself. Those are really, really neat, those 3-column tools. Super helpful in trying to undo those distortions. I'm going to pause right there because I kind of flew through a bunch of things. What questions do you have about either, let's say, anxiety in general or ways to work on it? What thoughts or questions would you have for me that might be useful to the group?
Recognizing distortion, is that like changing your self-talk also?
The question is recognizing a distortion the same as changing self-talk? Yes, right? Because in the head, where the thoughts are, that is, in fact, how you're talking to yourself, right? So if I could change those distorted thoughts into reality-based thoughts, then my self-talk changes, right? Do I give ideas on how to change self-talk? Well, if you come to me personally as a therapist, you get less of that. I come from the theory more that I want you to build your own language, okay? So often I will just ask people to take a stab at it, okay? So for example, with teenagers, a lot of times if I have them doing this, what's the first phrase? I don't know, right? How would you reframe that? I don't know. First of all, they say it that fast because they don't want to do it. And then I'll say, okay, well, you have a choice. Take a guess or ask for help. And then they can do it. Does that make sense? I could fill in the blank for them, but it's cheating. I want them to come up with the thought on their own. Sometimes you'll just see examples, right? We'll give examples and they can kind of look at examples, but often I want you to come up with your own verbiage, the things that will stick in your mind, right? Good question. Other thoughts, questions, things you're noticing? Yeah.
Also, that's why it's so important to put this in schools,
Yeah.
because they treat others differently when they understand these things.
Yes, the comment is understand that fears come in all shapes and sizes. Just because I'm not afraid of that doesn't mean it's unreasonable for you to be afraid of that, right? So some empathy or patience and understanding how these things affect others. One of the neat things I think in the course of my career is that we now have a little bit more what we can take as good science to say that there is biology associated with these things. And so some patience is required. If I'm in a home where it seems like everything's on fire all the time, I probably can't sit still in a classroom, which means I can't learn. And if I can't learn, my IQ goes down and all these other opportunities go away. So I need to be empathetic. Yes?
I have a fear that when I felt like fear when nobody's in my apartment, get that feeling
Yeah.
of anxiety that somebody's gonna take my things without
Okay.
my permission, because I'm afraid of somebody stealing when I
Sure.
don't give them something that I want to keep. Like I bought some blue jeans yesterday.
Okay.
And I had that fear
Yeah.
last night when I was getting rid of my old blue jeans, because I outshrunk them
Okay.
and I bought me some smaller size blue jeans.
How do you get through it when it feels like that? What do you do?
I always talk to myself and
Good.
worry about it.
Oh, yeah.
I'm worried about everything.
Yeah. That's a hard thing to do. Have those worries. Yeah, when you get that fear. Yeah, and sometimes we want to have other ways to try and get through it. When you're alone and your fear is like that, that's hard to do by yourself sometimes. Absolutely. That's understandable.
You can't stop anybody from stealing from your house.
That's the scary thought.
Use a screwdriver or a piece of metal
Lots of things, yeah,
door to get
to worry about, right?
you want to steal something.
Right. So one of the skills that sometimes I'll teach people too is just the idea of having a thought that you can repeat to yourself over and over again. I'll show you mine. Oh, there you go. Mine is at the bottom of your handout. I think it's the last thing on your handout, which says, "There is nothing that will happen today that together God and I can't handle." I will say that in my head in any situation. I say it on bridges all the time. I say it in traffic. I say it in sessions when I don't know what I'm going to say to somebody. There's nothing that will happen today that together God and I can't handle. So that's a distraction thought, right? If I feel anxious and worried, I just want one thought that I can go to and repeat that over and over. You can only have one thought in your head on purpose at a time. Did you know that? You can only have one thought in your head on purpose at a time. So if you replace that one you have with this one, now you have to think about this one, at least for a couple of seconds. Right? Yeah.
How do you draw the line between reasonable fear and unreasonable?
The question is, how do you draw the line between reasonable and unreasonable?
Fear is a protection against danger.
Yep.
And what may be some people, fear is, like for example, fear of a dog.
Yes, fear of a dog.
Reasonable or unreasonable?
Right. You know, the psychology answer is going to be it depends, right? So usually what I'll say is if you don't know the answer to that for yourself, like in a particular case, if you don't know if it's justified, ask yourself the second question, do I want it down anyway? Because, so for example, is fear of dogs justified? It could be, right? In your head, it could be. Is this dog actually a dog to be afraid of? I don't know. I haven't had enough experience with this dog, so I don't know. Well, I would say based on the event and your generalization of the thoughts about a Rottweiler, it's probably reasonable. That doesn't mean it's justified. See the difference? So I have a understandable and reasonable fear of bridges, probably. I mean, you could look at me and say, that's reasonable. I mean, people who hear stories like that, probably reasonable, they're afraid. It's still not justified by the situation, because I don't have enough facts to say that yet. Now, that's a thin line, right? My question then always comes to the second one. do you need to get it down? Is it interfering in your life, this fear? So if you're out walking and this particular Rottweiler comes by every night when you're walking and you want to not change your route, you need to find a way to reduce the fear because it's interfering in your life. Does that help? Kind of. There's reasonable fears. We will do this. There's certain people whose job it is to not be afraid of things that all the rest of us would reasonably be afraid of. Police officers, firefighters, nurses, doctors, right? They have learned, they use this in reverse, to not be afraid of things that typical people would be afraid of. So we can learn not to do that. You can be desensitized to things if you would like. That's essentially what this is. Good question. Yeah.
What do you do with a young person who's in the middle of a reaction that's just spiraling out of control? How do you stop it from
Like fear. We're going to talk about fear, I think, just because we're talking about anxiety. But yeah.
they've lost any cognition?
Sure. Question is, what do you do with someone in the throes of anxiety? So typically, whether you term that a panic attack or not, it doesn't matter. But the first thing we want to do is try and get the emotion to go down just enough that you can even reason, right? You can even talk. You can even get them to pay attention. So breathing, anything biological. Breathing, number one. Most people, when they're anxious, they do one of two things. Either they stop breathing altogether or they breathe super fast. So either one is not conducive to good oxygen flow and thinking. So breathing is important. I teach people, there's a lot of breathing techniques you can use. I teach people the 4 square breathing. So you count to 4. You inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, wait for 4. And when I do it with kidlets, I have them put their hand on my hand till we get it down, okay? Yeah. Just keeps going. It depends on the age of the child and your relation to the child. So, for example, I would guess that we need some serious eye contact to get attention. Makes it worse. And probably some, depending, some physicality might be needed. Okay. Like I said, depends on the child and the age. But anything, any self-regulation, and of course, it's also teaching self-regulation ahead of time. When you see yourself starting to be anxious, what are you doing ahead of time? So again, like it's an age-appropriate kind of task to figure out what can they do ahead of time and how fast can they recognize it. Sometimes they can't, right? If we think about some of the biology that goes on, sometimes it's going to take a lot of work to get them to recognize it. But we can work on that and try and teach. That's what we do in therapy a lot too, is what are the techniques that are going to work for one person? There's categories, but they don't all work for everyone. But I would start with biology if you can. Just breathing is really important. Yes? Okay, so the question is a little bit more about the differences between depression and anxiety. Sometimes I'll say it this way. I'm trying to go back to that slide. Most people, if you try and categorize it this way, anxiety tends to have a lot to do with future, and depression tends to have a lot to do with the past. Now, when I have anxiety over bridges, it looks like it's from the past, but it's not. It's going on now, right? Depression would be more, I can't go places because of that event, right? I'm living in the now and I'm scared. That's anxiety, as opposed to depression, which is more ruminating of the past a lot of the time. Now, what will happen, though, on that first slide when I was talking about the changes in anxiety and depression, what does happen for some people is they'll start out actually as anxious, and over the course of time, depending on how their mental health goes, they will become depressed. That's because your brain cannot live in crisis mode your whole life. It will hit some sort of tipping point where it can't keep doing that, right? So sometimes that will happen. If anxiety has been the primary problem for some time, you will see people who kind of move more towards the depression side simply because it's so overwhelming. So typically that's how I see that. There are differences though. There are certain anxieties that rarely go to depression. They just become behavioral, like social anxiety sometimes, or phobias of certain kinds. Like me, it doesn't morph into other things. It's very specific, right? So the more pervasive anxiety gets, the more likely the depression. If it's singular, then it's easier to contain. Does that make sense? Yeah. It's a little more rare to go from depression to anxiety unless the depression was based initially on some anxious thought process, which is normally not the case. Good questions. You guys are really astute. Yes.
Another observation, I think sometimes parents don't need to do this, but they do it to kids, especially in school. As a teacher,
Yeah.
so I hated it when a parent said to me, well, I never was good in math either.
Oh,
Because they've told their child math is bad.
math is hard. Yeah.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
But those are things that we do unconsciously
Sure.
to other people that we interact with.
Sure. Unconscious bias is a part of a lot of how we interact with people. We don't realize how they internalize what we said. I'll have my example of that is parents. A lot of times they'll have two different children, right? And the comment will be, "But I raised them exactly the same." Well, you couldn't have, right? Their internal experience of you is entirely different. They bring a whole different lens, a whole different thought process. You could treat children exactly the same; they'll come out entirely different, right? Because of their internal experience, not because of anything you did. Right? It's how they internalize it. Okay, I want to get to the end here because these are the promises that we carry with us no matter what. I can't wait to get to heaven. I have a list a mile long of things that I want to ask God. I hope he has time for us. He's a busy guy. But I think about what's tough for me is when people come and they're so despondent about their mental health. A lot of times they will come to the point where they want to believe, or they do believe, that this is punishment of some kind. Okay. One of the very first things that I want is for them to walk out of my office knowing grace is theirs. No matter how you think or feel about what's going on in your life, grace is yours. The theology of the cross, or the theology of suffering, preaches Christ crucified for all. That means that suffering is part of the human condition, not individual sin. We live in a sinful world. It's broken. Why wouldn't mental health suffering be a part of that? Just like physical suffering, just like social, economic suffering, just like any other thing. Christ's love compels us because he died once for all. We already know that. So even if I came with a mindset that said I must have done something wrong, number one, suffering's part of the human condition. This is not individual to me or to you. And that's an important message, I think, to share with people who have mental health struggles. And number two, a lot of times people who struggle with their mental health think they don't have enough faith. If I could just faith harder, or I must be weak because I can't trust God enough. That's the devil working on you. That's a first commandment problem. Faith is a gift of God, not a work of man. So even if that's true, which it's not, it's by grace I've been saved through faith, not by works, right? I can't faith harder in order for God to love me and save me, right? So those are two things that I work really hard to make sure that people who visit us hear and understand. And that's a special message that not everyone gets in the secular counseling world, and so that's why I work where I work, because I feel very compelled that time is short, and the mental health community now is the biggest mission field there probably is. And if we can share the grace of God with others whose mental health is struggling, that would be very impactful for eternity. So I hope that this has been helpful to help you understand the plight of some of these things, how they work, how we therapeutically know to help, but to understand that no matter what, faith is a gift of God for those who struggle with mental health challenges too. So With that, I think I am done. 2 minutes late. Yes, one question yet.
Yeah, I just had more an announcement than
An announcement. Okay.
the church library had ordered 2 copies of the book, Whatever is True by William Whittington, and they have come in this week, so they are out on the shelves up here for anyone who'd like to check.
Okay. There are copies of What is True by William Buddington for checkout. 2 copies available in the back here by the library.
On the shelves
Okay.
outside the door.
Just outside the door here of the chancel. Wonderful. I did leave you some resources too on your handout if you're interested in more information on Christian mental health. These might be helpful to you too. But blessings on your day. Thank you very much for having me.